Thursday nights will never be the same again. Thursday Night Chat. You're on the spot.
Hi friends and happy Thursday evening. You have made Thursday Night Chat your habit, and once again we're here live, especially so that we are on holiday today. We have invited our guest who is not exactly a stranger to Thursday Night Chat because he has been our guest in some past episode, and we will be talking to him today, especially so that we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of what we know as People Power Revolution, or the Bloodless Revolution of February of 1986. So without much further ado, friends, I'd like to introduce our guest for tonight. He is the former Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Philippines to the Republic of Cuba with concurrent jurisdiction over Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica, as well as consular jurisdiction over the Bahamas. He is an adjunct professor at present of the School of Public Affairs and Governance of Silliman University. Friends, it is my pleasure to introduce to our televiewers Ambassador Dr. MacArthur F. Corsino. Maayong gabi, Ambassador, and welcome once again to Thursday Night Chat.
Maayong gabi, Sil. Good evening to everybody. It's great to be here once again to discuss whatever is the pressing issue of the day.
Correct. Yes, and since we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of People Power, touted as the first televised revolution by people on history 30 years ago, can you take us back, sir, when you were also part of government, if I'm not mistaken? You were part of the administration of then strongman, President Ferdinand Marcos. But you were elsewhere, sir, right? On duty.
Yes, I was, of course, a member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of the Philippines at that time. Although I was on fellowship in Harvard University, I had arrived in Harvard sometime in late August or early September 1985, and stayed there until these developments took place. Maybe I should say right now that I had resigned from the Marcos regime, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in January 1986.
Oh, so about a month before the February Revolution.
Yes, it might be recalled that President Marcos had called a snap presidential election.
Yes, that's right. Snap elections.
Sometime in early November 1985. And therefore, thereafter, the campaign started, and Corazon Aquino rose to be the opposition candidate after Salvador Laurel gave way to her. So Cory Aquino was the presidential candidate, while Laurel agreed to be the vice president.
Yes.
And when the campaign began to heat up, as a fellow at Harvard University, who was also at the same time a member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an officer of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I began to receive some signals from Manila to campaign for Marcos in the American Academe. That means to try to defend the Marcos regime in order to support the candidature of President Marcos. And one of the proposals was for a seminar that was pro-Marcos to be held at the Harvard University or at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is in Tufts University, which is just nearby the Harvard University campus. And when I began to receive these strong signals, and in my conscience I could not possibly obey, I could not possibly imagine standing up there talking before the American Academy and telling statements or saying statements which I myself did not believe in, because I had felt that this was the chance for the Filipino people under the candidature of Corazon Aquino to be finally freed from the yoke of dictatorship, authoritarianism, from economic failure, from increasing internal conflict. And this was a chance, a final chance. Finally, a chance had come up after so many years for Filipinos to be able to vote for the right person freely, and therefore remove the regime through a peaceful means. So I submitted my letter of resignation on January 19, 1986, which was published in the Boston Globe on January 22nd, and which also came to be published in the Philippine Daily Inquirer on January 30, and later on in the Manila Times in Manila on February 6. Now you must remember that the election was to be held on February 7. And
Snap election,
the
sir.
the snap election. And I decided to resign about 2 weeks before that. And of course, the news of my resignation reached the highest levels of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it stunned the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that is why he tried to send a representative to me at Harvard to try to convince me to
Reconsider?
or to retract or to give up, whatever is the term for that, my resignation. And in fact, he offered some very attractive
Opportunity, another job.
incentives,
Yes. Okay.
which were tempting because as a Harvard Fellow, my funding came from the Asia Foundation, which was really not enough. In fact, I was the most underfunded of around 18 fellows from different countries of the world. And I could hardly make both ends meet.
Your family was
My
with you, sir?
family was with me,
Okay.
my wife and 3 children.
3 children already at that time?
Yes,
Okay.
and my
All girls, sir, right?
all girls,
Yes.
and my wife had
Yes.
even had to do some work outside in
Yes.
order to
Make
help,
both ends meet, no?
raise our incomes.
Yes, yes.
And the offers were very attractive, but I frankly told the acting minister's representative that I had crossed the bridge I could not possibly retract, and it would be against my principles, against my upbringing, against my Christian belief, against what I had learned in Dimole and Masonry, to retract what I believed in and to stand up and tell either lies or half truths. So that was how I made a stand against the dictatorship.
So it was not really difficult for you, sir, to make that particular decision?
It was
To-
not
yeah.
difficult for me because the choice was crystal clear. It's either you continue with bondage and authoritarianism and an aura of repression, human rights violations, and so on, and a chance at freedom and a new leadership that would really lead the Philippines towards economic recovery, internal stability, and democracy. So the choice was very clear.
But prior to that, sir, you were already a member of the government, right? Being with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But this particular request from your bosses actually triggered your decision to submit your resignation, not prior, not before that particular happening or occurrence, because you were still a member of the government, being
Yes.
with the MFA.
I
the
had
Ministry of
been
Foreign Affairs.
the acting director of the United States Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Manila when I was sent over to Cambridge, Boston area for my fellowship at Harvard. And, for a while, we tried to get by with the kind of government we were trying to represent. And there were times when we thought maybe this was still a defensible regime. And at a seminar that I gave in November at the Harvard Center for International Affairs, I in fact made an objective I tried to make an objective assessment of the Marcos regime. But then came the signals for me to really come up and stand up and speak unequivocally in favor of the Marcos regime, to defend the regime, and in fact to campaign for the Marcos candidacy before the American academe, the American audience, and I revolted against that idea.
So it did not in any way affect your fellowship, sir, at Harvard? Like you were not asked to like stop or something like leave the U.S. or something like that? It did not affect in any way your stay in the U.S.?
There was, in fact, an important effect on my status, not as a Harvard fellow, because that was something which the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could not touch. But my funding source, as I said, came from the Asia Foundation. And shortly after I tendered my resignation, and it was widely publicized, especially in the United States, I received a long-distance phone call from the Asia Foundation based in San Francisco, telling me that because of my resignation, they were now considering the cancellation of my monthly stipend. And the stipend, as I said, was not really that big, but it was still quite important and useful.
That's true. During that particular time, no? Because
During
you were
that particular
a fellow.
time.
Yes, yes. So what happened, sir?
Well, I said, if you are going to stop my stipend, what can I do? And then I argued that...
So it was some kind of a pressure, sir, no? Pressure on your part.
It was a pressure upon me, and together with the enticement from the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, offering me attractive emoluments, which would include family allowance, living quarters allowance, overseas allowance, and so on, which would have amounted to maybe almost $5,000. Remember, I was just receiving $900 a month from the Asia Foundation. So that was that particular pressure upon me, which in fact affected my status as an Asia Foundation grantee, rather being a fellow at Harvard University. Otherwise, my fellowship was not affected. My stay in the United States was not affected at all.
So when the revolution finally happened, sir, on February 22 up to 25, you were still in the U.S. at the time.
Yes, if we will just backtrack a little bit,
yes.
You know, the election was held on February 7 here in the Philippines. And then shortly after that, there was solid evidence that Marcos was trying to steal the elections. And then the Harvard Institute of Politics, which is really the institute that would discuss these political issues, decided to sponsor a symposium at the John F. Kennedy School of Government in Harvard University. And I was one of those who was asked to speak, together with Ambassador William Sullivan, who was the former U.S. Ambassador to Manila, Arnold Zeitner, who was a former bureau chief of the Associated Press in Manila, and Dr. Jonathan Moore, who was the moderator and was the head of that institute. But at the last minute, Ambassador Sullivan was replaced by Professor Richard Haas, a public policy professor of Harvard, and who later became a high-ranking government official in the United States. And just before that symposium was held, there was news from Washington that Reagan was saying that fraud was being committed by both sides. That means by the Marcos and the Cory campaigns or sides. But there was already much evidence. In fact, just before the symposium was held, there was already this boycott by tabulators, computer tabulators at the PICC, protesting what they saw was an attempt by the Marcos regime to steal the elections by manipulating the scores that were coming in.
Yes. So I think they staged a walkout.
Yeah, they staged a walkout. Yes, a walkout is the term. And so it was very clear that the fraud was being committed not by the Cory side, but by the Marcos side, because it alone had the paraphernalia for this kind of fraud and stealing. And therefore, at this symposium on February 11, 1986, I emphasized that the Reagan administration was taking a very wrong step, and that it should now see that it was Corazon Aquino who had won the election, and the Filipino people were angry at the Marcos regime for trying to steal and change the results. And I therefore urged the audience there, which was composed of academic people, professors, students, and citizens in the Boston, Cambridge area. I urged them to persuade the Reagan administration and the U.S. government to take definite sides in favor of Cory, and therefore to avoid what could become a very explosive situation and a major foreign policy problem for the United States. It was also at the time, at the symposium, when it was announced that Evelio Javier had been assassinated, if we might use the word, by Marcos goons was it in Antique?
Yeah, this was one of the celebrated assassination, if we may call it as such. Yeah.
So we had to emphasize there at that symposium. Symposium was on February 11, so this was about 11 days before
the start of the revolution.
Start of EDSA revolution. Yeah. So we had to emphasize at that time that the U.S. should now side with righteousness and the people of the Philippines, and therefore side with Cory as the real winner of the election. And if I might insert this at that time, when I resigned from the Marcos regime and stand the upper ranks of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some of them were saying that Corsino is doing that because he is so far away, Secondly, they were saying maybe he's planning to immigrate to the United States.
US, yeah, because you were in the US, and the situation was actually getting to be like controversial and very hot,
Yes.
so to speak, in the Philippines.
Right, but what I know is that some of those Ministry of Foreign Affairs stalwarts were very, very pro-Marcos and pro-Romualdez. And while there were a few who were, shall we say, tending to favor Cory Aquino, they were afraid.
Yeah.
They
They did not come out in the open,
They did not
sir.
come out in the open. And then finally the revolution, unexpected to us, broke out. And that was the time when some of these Ministry of Career people who were my colleagues began to change sides and to shift towards the Cory Aquino bandwagon. And maybe I should also say that when this news about the EDSA revolution broke out after February 22, you know, the United States is about 1 day late,
Yes, 1 day
compared
late,
to
yeah.
Philippine time.
Okay, so it was yet February 21 in the
Yeah,
US
yes.
at that time.
But by the time that it became full-blown and was on U.S. television or maybe worldwide television, Filipinos in Boston began to gather together. And in fact, I was one of the, shall we say, leaders of the group, together with Dr. Stephen Aguilar. Stephen Aguilar was the president of the Benigno S. Aquino Memorial Foundation in honor of the late Ninoy Aquino. And so together with him and some other leaders of the Filipino community like Dr. Philip Suva Martin and Mary Rose Espeleta, who was formerly a CONCON delegate of the 1971 Constitutional Convention. We, together with the other Filipinos, were on the television and on radio. And in fact, I was interviewed at least 5 times on TV and several more times over radio. And our resignation and our position was published in the Harvard Crimson, which is equivalent to the Silimanian
Yes,
here.
the newspaper, yes.
And the newspaper,
Crimson,
Harvard
yes.
newspaper.
Yes.
And some other related news organs. So we were there even as the revolution raged back home. We were cheering before the television and on the air for the Filipino people and for the revolution. That is why one of my colleagues later said, well, Mac, I think you were one of the leaders of the Boston chapter of the EDSA revolution.
Yeah.
And I took that as a compliment.
Okay. Yeah. And the Aquinos, of course, were very popular in Boston because they lived there for some years, sir, right?
Yes.
In that particular
yes.
area.
In
Yes.
fact, the former home of the Aquinos became one of our headquarters.
Ah, okay.
And we
Yeah.
would gather there together.
Yes.
And you know, this home became some kind of a memorial for Ninoy Aquino. And in fact, after he was assassinated, the bloodied safari
Yeah.
jacket
Yes.
of Ninoy Aquino was exhibited
Oh,
there
in this home. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Yeah. Before he actually was buried, no? Because his wake was at Santo Domingo Church in the Philippines after when he died, sir.
Yes, but his jacket somehow was
somehow?
transported
Oh,
from the Philippines
okay.
to the U.S. and was
Oh.
displayed
Yeah, part of the
in the Aquino
memorabilia.
home as part
Yes.
of the memorabilia for
Yes.
Ninoy Aquino, together with other photographs, photos,
Oh,
and
yes,
other
yes,
memorabilia.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
yes, indeed, he was assassinated
Yes, that's
in
right.
Manila at
Yes.
the
In
international airport.
1983, something like
Yes,
3
1980s.
years before
Yes.
the February Revolution.
Yes.
sir. And then we will fast forward to the present time. And I think it is an opportune time for all of us, our young televiewers who may not even have been born, of course, during that particular time. They have no inkling at all about the February Revolution in 1986. Many among our televiewers and among our young people today were not even born during martial law, sir. So we will ask this particular question after we pause for this break as to where we are now, 30 years after the February Revolution. So we will be right back with Ambassador MacArthur Corsino on this day when we celebrate the 30th anniversary of People Power. We will be right back.